After appearing on the map, I was surrounded by an endless desert where almost no life could be seen. Only a small pond with water stood out, near which a bit of vegetation was growing. This is exactly where we will have to survive. Unfortunately, we have neither money nor equipment or tools. So, first, we need to somehow earn some. For this, I began looking for any possible way to make money. I walked around the area and even tried catching fish with my hands, but nothing worked. And just at the moment when I had already lost hope any way to earn money, I discovered an old container on the shore of the pond. It seems it could bring us money. So, I took it and carried it to the selling point nearby. It turned out that we were paid $42 for the container. Great. Our first money is in our pocket. Although this amount is clearly not enough even to buy a simple axe. So, I had no choice but to continue exploring the surrounding area. Unfortunately, I found nothing else near the pound, so I decided to move a bit farther away and keep searching. Soon, my attention was drawn to a similar container like the one I had found earlier, and in the distance, I could see several more containers. Well, that's good. We can earn money from them and hopefully quickly collect $200. Well, now let's sell them and see how much we can earn. As I expected, we managed to get $294. Great. Now we can definitely buy an axe, which is necessary for further earnings. So, we move on to the next stage, harvesting wood from old trees. Taking the axe in my hands, I approached one of these old trunks and tried to cut it down, but it fails because by mistake, I bought the wrong axe. So I reached the store again and purchased a new one Roth of $50. After which, I began splitting the dry trunk into small logs that can be carried by hand. Now the wood is ready for sale. So I grabbed a small log and started dragging it to the selling point, which, by the way, was not far away. Upon arrival, I did not sell this log because I decided to bring the entire trunk first to see how much we could earn. I had to run back and forth quite a lot because even though the trunk was small, I had cut it into many small pieces that I constantly had to return for. But fortunately, I managed it, and now the entire trunk is here, so let's sell it. Excellent. I expected the amount to be a bit smaller, but we were paid almost $140, so we need to think about how to properly allocate this money. First of all, I went to the store to look at the items I was interested in, and there I decided to buy a handcart like this with which we can transport logs, and it cost only $100. It still seemed to me that $1,000 would not be enough to start creating our own farm, so I grabbed the cart and began pushing it to another fallen tree, which I, as usual, cut down and cleared of branches. Now it was necessary to cut this trunk into parts, but doing it with an axe turned out to be very inconvenient. The trunk was cut very easily, and I decided to cut it into slightly larger pieces since we now have a cart, which makes transporting logs easier. After cutting, I loaded several logs onto the cart and tried to secure them with straps so they would not fall out on the way, but this not worked. This cart not supports it. So I again took one more round with hands, and now we collected about $286, and I also sold out my old cart in $84 with a loss of $16. And then I again visited store to buy a brand new cart. After that, I reached to a dry tree, cut it down and chopped it down in small pieces. Then I loaded log in cart, secured them with straps, and then I started transporting them to the selling point. By the way, the cart performed its function perfectly, and the wheels did not sink into the loose sand at all, which allowed me to quickly deliver the logs to the selling point and earn another $171 for our budget. Now, we need to return to the felled trunk and collect the remaining pieces, which I also successfully loaded onto our cart. And by the way, I managed to take absolutely everything, after which my path once again led to the selling point where I sold the wood. Now our balance was already over $1,000, so I decided to start creating our own farm, and to do this, we first needed to choose a location on this desert map. After walking around the area, I found a fairly flat spot and decided to settle here. For this, first of all, we need a place to stay. So, in construction mode, I built a small wooden house for $100 and a small bench of $50 for rest at the middle of work. It will become the foundation of our farm. In it, we will be able to rest and perform basic tasks. The next thing I decided to do was to lay the foundation of a real farm, and by that I mean, of course, a field. To create it, we will need special equipment, so I went to the store. And based on our budget, I think you already understand that it will be manual equipment, since we simply do not have money for a tractor. In the end, in the store, I bought a small hand plow for $200, with which we will try to create our first field. So, we head to the plot. After choosing the place where the field will be located, I lowered the plow and began plowing, and denser soil began to appear from the sand, which should be quite fertile. By the way, at first, I decided to plow the boundaries of our field. As you can see, I made it not very large, since it is very inconvenient to work on large areas with manual tools, and it takes too much time. So, now we only need to plow the soil within the boundaries we created. That is what I started doing, while also thinking about what could be planted here. Wheat and other crops will most likely grow poorly here because there is little water in the soil. So, I think we should plant some root crops or something similar. As for the hand plow, it handled its task quite well, although it was rather difficult to plow the land by hand, but that is not so bad, considering that this tool cost little. I managed to finish creating the field only in the evening, when the sun was already setting beyond the horizon. The only downside is that the plow does not have a harrow, and the large clumps of soil remained that will interfere with planting. So, later, we will need to break them up with a cultivator. After completing the whole field, first of all, the soil had to be cultivated to break up the large and dense clumps of earth. To carry out the cultivation, we of course need special equipment, a cultivator. In the end, I chose a hand cultivator, a simple but still effective option, and its cost was $200. And additionally, I also purchased a manual seeder as I have to use it in showing seeds, which, although it hit the budget, was a justified investment. After the purchase, I immediately headed back to our fields, pushing the cultivator manually along the road. Upon reaching the plot, I prepared for work, lowered the equipment to the ground, and began the cultivation process. Gradually, pass after pass, I started breaking up the large clumps of soil, making it looser and suitable for future sowing. And after the very first pass, it was already noticeable how much the structure of the soil had changed. It became much softer and more even. It is worth noting that the working width of this cultivator turned out to be larger than that of our previous plow, which significantly sped up the process. And in addition, it was much easier to work with it. There was no need to apply as much effort as during plowing, which made the cultivation noticeably faster and less tiring. After that, I realized that we urgently needed to replenish our budget since the money had almost run out. So, I sent the equipment back to our house, and I took the cart and decided to start gathering wood. It was one of the most accessible ways to earn money at this stage. I headed to the nearest dry tree, cut it down, and began carefully cutting the trunk into pieces. And I gradually loaded the resulting logs into the cart. Of course, it was not possible to transport the entire tree at once, so I had to make several trips, but it was almost dark. So, the work for today is finished, and we can go rest in our house. The next morning when I woke up, I was ready for work. Today, we have no less to do than yesterday. To begin with, I decided not to limit myself to just one tree and continued gathering wood. When a fairly large pile of wood had already accumulated, I took it for sale. This time, the result was even better. Our budget exceeded $6,000, which already looked much more serious and opened up new opportunities for development. And I was very pleased with this result and immediately decided to invest this money into further development of our farm. After returning to the plot, I switched to construction mode and began choosing a suitable production. And in the end, I chose a small firewood production unit, and its construction cost about half of our budget. But it was a strategically important investment. As the name suggests, this production is intended for processing wood into firewood. And since we had no problems with raw materials, it looked like an excellent option for stable income. However, to start the production, it was necessary to gather wood again. Fortunately, there was another dry trunk nearby. I cut it down and began cutting it into smaller parts so they could be carried by hand, and then I gradually transported all the logs directly to the production. As a result, the storage filled up quite quickly, and surprisingly, even one such tree was enough to almost completely fill the production, while there was still some left over, which meant that everything was ready to start. I activated the production, and now all that remained was to wait until the wood was processed into finished firewood, which will take some time. So, for now, we can focus on other tasks and continue developing our farm. Next, I decided to return to working on our fields, because after cultivation, the soil had already had some time to rest and was now fully ready for the next stage, sowing. And this is a very important moment, since the future harvest directly depends on the quality of sowing. To carry out the sowing as expected, we will need special equipment, so I went to the store again. However, as before, our options were limited due to the budget. That's why we have a manual seeder, which cost $300, and although it was quite a noticeable expense, without it, it would have been impossible to move forward. In addition to the seeder itself, it was necessary to purchase seeds, so I bought bags of seeds with a total of about $1,200, which are more expensive than out tools because of their quality. This turned out to be enough to completely fill the storage of the new seeder. Thus, everything was ready to begin the sowing campaign. Without wasting time, I headed back to the fields, carefully pushing the seeder along the road. And upon reaching the plot, I decided to start with the first field where I decided to plant something more unusual, sunflowers. In my opinion, for our sandy area, this is quite an interesting experiment, and despite the conditions not being ideal, I expected that the crop would take flowers, especially considering that it can draw moisture from deeper layers of the soil. Before starting the main work, I made several test passes along the edges of the field to better orient myself and set the correct direction, after which I proceeded to full sowing. After that, I moved to the second field. I planned to sow grass. After selecting the appropriate seeds, I lowered the special handle and began working. Honestly, despite its simplicity, the design of the seeder proved to be quite effective. Of course, later it will be necessary to check whether any gaps were left, but at first glance, everything worked properly. As a result, I managed to sow the entire field properly. And just like with the first field, the process went quickly and without any difficulties. After that, I left the seeder near the house and I decided to check our production. And as it turned out, several pallets of finished firewood had already accumulated there. And considering that our budget had proved up to the production, and carefully began loading the boxes of firewood. After loading, I secured them with straps so that they would not fall out during transportation, and then headed to the selling point. Upon arrival, I sold the entire batch of firewood and received a very solid amount for it, more than $7,000. It was an excellent result and clear proof that the investment in production fully paid off, since the income from processing turned out to be significantly higher than from simply selling wood. After returning to the farm, I decided not to delay development and to invest the earned money into a new direction. Switching to construction mode, I chose to plant about 10 cacti. These plants are capable of producing fruits that can be sold, providing an additional source of income. However, they require water to grow, which means it was necessary to organize its supply. Fortunately, there was a pond not far from our farm from which we could take water. So, to organize this process, I went to the store again, where I bought a special tank for transporting liquid, which cost $300. After the purchase, I immediately got to work. I rolled the tank to the water source, filled it with water, and then carefully transported it back to our cacti. And now, all that remained was to regularly supply them with water and wait for the first results. But even taking into account that we had started supplying our cacti with water, this amount was clearly not enough because the barrel's capacity was only 500 liters, while the plant's needs were much greater. And that meant that I would have to go to the reservoir and back more than once in order to fill the system completely. As a result, this work dragged on much longer than I had expected. The constant trips back and forth took a lot of time and effort, and only by the middle of the second half of the day did I manage to completely transport the required amount of water. Although now, our cacti are provided with everything they need and can begin to bear fruit. And this took almost the entire day. It became obvious that in the future, this problem would definitely need to be solved, either by increasing the transport volume or by somehow automating the process. After that, I again made a trip of firewood and sold it, but I saw the raw material is about to run out, so I picked up my card and axe, cut down a tree, loaded into trolley, and sold it in sawmill. Now it was too dark, so I went to our house for rest. The next morning greeted me with bright, sunny weather, which immediately lifted my mood and set me up for productive work. First of all, I went to check the condition of our fields, and the result pleasantly surprised me. The sunflower had already begun to sprout, just like the previously sown grass, which meant that the sowing was successful. In addition, it became clear that the seeder did its job perfectly. There were no noticeable gaps in the fields, which once again confirmed that purchasing the equipment was the right decision. But for now, I had to work with what was available. Fortunately, our firewood production was already operating, and enough finished product had accumulated there. So I decided to take advantage of this opportunity. Taking the cart, I began loading firewood and gradually transporting it to the selling point in order to replenish our budget once again and continue developing our farm. Of course, it was not possible to take all the firewood in one trip. So I had to make several trips to completely transport all the production from the facility. However, the result was definitely worth it. In the end, our balance increased significantly and reached almost $27,000, and that is already serious money with which we can move to a new stage of farm development. Several months passed, and during that time, there was no special work, so I allowed myself to rest a little and wait for the results of our previous actions. And as it turned out, it was not in vain. When I went out again to check the fields, excellent news was waiting for me. The sunflower had grown noticeably and looked quite healthy, and the grass had reached the stage where it could already be mowed, which meant that it was time to move on to the next stage. I went to the store to buy the necessary equipment, and among the available options, I liked a compact mower costing $450, which seemed to me optimal in terms of price and efficiency, so I decided to buy it. Besides that, it was the first fully fledged mechanical device on our farm, which in itself was already a small step forward. After returning, I started the engine and headed to the field. Upon arrival, I lowered the mower and got to work, and despite its small size, it handled even tall grass quite confidently. It is true that during the work, one small issue came up. In some places, the mower blades began to get clogged with grass, because of which it was thrown out unevenly to the back. But this did not become a serious problem, and practically did not affect the working speed. Although the mower's working width was relatively small, this was compensated for by its high operating speed, thanks to which I managed to mow the grass on the entire field completely in just a few hours. Then I safely placed my mover under shed and noticed out. Cactus fruits are harvested, so without wasting any time, I picked my card, loaded the pretty cactus fruits in it, and sold it. It took 2 trips for selling 4 pallets. Then I returned my cart under shed. Now, I was faced with the next task, figuring out how to preserve the cut grass for future use, especially if we plan to keep animals. And for that, of course, additional investments will be needed. For this, I went to the store again and bought a manual baler with which grass can be collected into bales, which greatly simplifies storage and transportation. After returning to the field, I lowered the working mechanism and started collecting the grass, and the process itself turned out to be quite simple. I just had to pull the device forward, and it automatically collected the grass and formed it into neat bales. But suddenly, I almost immediately decided to invest part of the funds into livestock farming, and without much hesitation, I switched to construction mode and built a pen, which cost $14,000, but it was an important investment for the future. In this pen, both sheep and goats can be kept, and after thinking a bit, I decided to go with goats. So I immediately bought 30 animals, spending another $16,000, after which our farm literally came to life. The area immediately began to look more inhabited and no longer seemed empty and abandoned. However, an obvious problem arose. The animals had no feed, since in desert conditions, it is simply impossible to find it just like that. So, this issue had to be solved independently. I picked my barrel and directly went to pound to fill water. After that, I immediately unloaded into pen, and fortunately, we already had a field with grass that could be used for preparing feed. I gave some of ales instantly to goats, and rest grass is to be baled yet, so I immediately completed this task fairly quickly and without much effort. As a result, we obtained ready bales of grass that are convenient to carry and store. And immediately after finishing the work, I took several bales into the pen to feed our goats. And they happily began eating the feed while I was thinking about where to place the remaining supplies. In the end, I set up a special covering on which the bales can be stored, which allowed me to neatly organize the storage of feed and protect it from spoilage. Now it's dark again, so I gone for rest. Very next morning, I checked my sunflowers. Oh, the flowers are there. Looking too much pretty for this moment. You have to drop a sweet like and subscribe. The next, I checked that most of our goats are fainted. So without wasting time, I immediately picked my barrel and filled water from the pound and then directly supplied to pen. But it was not enough, and I have fear of health of goats, so I made several trips to fulfill it. After completing that, it was necessary to solve the issue of transportation, since our old cart was clearly no longer able to handle the workload. So I decided to replace it with more suitable equipment. I went to shop, after which I began choosing a tractor, since it was time to move to a new level. In the end, I chose a relatively inexpensive option, costing up to $15,000. But now, money has been run out, so I was too much tensed as we have buy a cart. So I immediately checked our production, and I fortunately have a firewood pallet, which I sold immediately, without wasting a sec. Then, after I also purchased a flatbed trailer of about $5,000, which was perfect for transporting bales and other products. After the purchase, I started the engine, attached the trailer to the tractor, and set off to work. Upon reaching the field, I began loading the remaining pallets of firewood, carefully placing them one by one on the trailer. And in the end, just one trip was enough to transport the entire stock, after which I transported them to the selling location and neatly placed them on the shop and sold out. Now, our goats also prepared about 1,000 kilograms of milk, so I loaded it into my trailer and sold it. Now, our field and territory is looking awesome, but there is still a lot of work and development ahead of us. But we will deal with that next time. And if you like this video and want to see the continuation, just subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you!